and to look harder at previous cases of abuse, to try to understand what had caused them and who was responsible.
People like Tim Golden at the New York Times got a hold of it and started looking at the case of Dilawar in particular, the taxi driver. It became at least plausible to me that this man wasn't even guilty of anything other than being there when the sweep occurred. And here was a guy who was murdered in detention.
Our nation came under attack.
9/11 was very much in the air, and I think the officers tried to keep it in the air. They tried to remind these kids that these people are our enemies.
But it's hard to see how these young soldiers could have been expected to figure out who their real enemies were among a bunch of militiamen and farmers in a society that was completely foreign to them.
If I remember correctly, his story had something to do with the rocket attack on a military base, and he was supposed to be the driver of the getaway car.
He had taken his new car, which he was obviously excited about, and driven to Khost, the provincial capital, where he went to look for taxi passengers. And he, in fact, found these three men in Khost at the marketplace who were headed back to Yaqubli. You have to imagine that Dilawar was driving home from this provincial capital, which was about as far as his world stretched. He is stopped at Firebase Salerno by a group of Afghan militiamen, and the men apparently found an electric stabilizer in the trunk of the car, at least they claimed to. Camp Salerno had been rocketed from some distance earlier in the day, and the Afghan militiamen immediately arrested the four guys on suspicion of having had some involvement in that attack. He's taken to Bagram, this great distance away. You get a bunch of guys who are back at this detention site, and they're told, we have evidence that they have been involved in a rocket attack on American forces. So I think that kind of tripped a wire in them.
You're in this atmosphere, you're with nothing but military people, and you feel sort of morally isolated, and you lose your moral bearings. And you're frustrated because you're not getting intelligence from a prisoner that you believe is guilty and has intelligence to give you. And so, of course, you want to start pushing the limits. You want to see how far you can go.
A lot of the pressure came from the fact that we had a few high-value detainees that gave a lot of good information. And when we started to lose those detainees due to going to Guantanamo Bay, that they expected this to come from everybody.
We would interrogate some of these guys just to interrogate them, and it was ridiculous. I mean, you'd get some of these guys in, and you're like, this is the wrong man. This is not who we're supposed to have. Especially being a screener, you could tell from the moment you got them in, you're like, I'm not supposed to have them.
We had one prisoner came in who was mentally challenged, and Sergeant Loring kept saying that, you know, this is a cover. This is Al-Qaeda's cover. This is what they do. And I went in there and talked to him, and basically they had this guy in a diaper, and he had his own feces, but Loring kept saying it was an act.
They'd be like, hey, we want you to go yell at this guy. So I'd grab my box of Frosted Flakes that I was eating for breakfast that morning. I'd go into the room, and I'd be like, all right, I have to yell at you today. So I'd be like, dihydrogenated salt substitute, and just start yelling that at them. And they'd be like, they'd look at me all crazy, and I'd be like, yeah, that's your fault they put that in my cereal now. Or I'd yell at them if, you know, Elvis was really the king of rock, or if he was dead, or stuff like that. And I'd write that in my interrogation summaries, and I'd send that up to higher that that's what I did for that 2 hours.
You really can't get a feel for a person until after you talk to him a couple times. So in the first 3 times I talked to him, it was just verifying his story, looking for loops, looking for holes. After the 3rd time I talked to him, and his story was still consistent, I kept telling him I thought he was innocent.
And they wanted these people to be guilty because that would look better for their unit. They could say that we arrested 60 people this month, and they were all terrorists.
When was the last time you saw Osama bin Laden? When was the last time you saw Mullah Omar? Now, this was a standard question that was asked of every detainee.
It's very hard to go into an interrogation with very little evidence, and we almost never had evidence on these guys, and elicit a confession. You can go in and get intelligence, but if you're asking this guy to completely incriminate himself, it's very difficult. So you have to start using harsher and harsher techniques in order to elicit that confession.
I was yelled at for being too nice to him by Sergeant Loring, that I needed to put more pressure on him. Or as he liked to say, I need to take him out of his comfort zone.
After a while, particularly in the fourth and fifth interrogations, as the sleep deprivation that he was being subjected to really started to knock him out, the interrogations got more intense.
Sergeant Salcedo, who was an inexperienced interrogator but a kind of a can-do soldier, had this man who refused to look at her because she was a woman. She said she got very frustrated by this and grabbed him by the sides of the face and sort of turned him to face her and look at her and take her seriously. But of course, he was an Afghan man from a tribal conservative culture who didn't look at strange women.
Sergeant Salcedo was getting a little aggravated, so I kind of stepped in between them, and that's when I grabbed him by the shirt, and I brought him over to the wall.
They tried to make him stand up against the wall, and he was sliding down. They pushed him back against the wall.
He wasn't making any kind of sense. Most of it seemed to just be rambling. The interpreter was telling me that his wife came to visit him in a cell, which of course didn't happen.
If you've ever seen anybody sleep-deprived, past 2 days they begin to just be bumbling idiots. 3 days they're just worthless.
I knew something was wrong. The next thing I heard was that he died.
Not long after Dilawar was killed, we learned that the Afghan guerrilla commander whose men had arrested Dilawar and the others had in fact been detained by the Americans himself. And it turned out that he was rocketing their base and then picking up innocent Afghans and turning them over to the Americans, essentially to try to ingratiate himself with the U.S. forces. The 3 passengers were sent to Guantanamo, and they didn't get out until March of 2004, which was 15 months after they had been captured riding in the taxi. It's hard to know what reason the Americans would have had to send these guys on when they had quite clearly concluded that Dilawar, at least, was an innocent man when he was killed. It certainly makes you wonder about whether they just sent these guys on to cover their butts.
These are not mere innocents. These are among the worst of the worst.
These are among the most dangerous, best trained, vicious killers on the face of the earth.
They're terrorists, they're bomb makers, they're facilitators of terror, they're members of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban.
And if they were free, they would engage in murder once again.
Well, the only thing I know for certain is that these are bad people.
Despite Rumsfeld's and Cheney's and President Bush's allegations that these guys are the worst of the worst, that they were all captured on the battlefield, recent studies of the whole compendium of government's documents show that only 5% of these people were picked up by the United States. Only 8% of them are accused of being members of the Al-Qaeda. Over 90% of them were picked up by Northern Alliance or Pakistani forces in exchange for bounties.
We have large rewards out. We have leaflets that are dropping like snowflakes in December in Chicago.
An analysis of declassified government documents revealed that only 7% of Guantanamo detainees were captured by U.S. and coalition forces. The other 93%, like Dilawar and his passengers, were turned over by Afghan warlords and Pakistanis, sometimes for cash payments of thousands of dollars.
You know, the military is not interested in spending whatever it is, $40,000 a year detaining people who are not members of Al-Qaeda in Guantanamo Bay. It has as much interest as everyone else does in making sure that people who are detained are actually members of Al-Qaeda rather than wasting resources and time detaining innocent people.
I think it's natural in times of war to pick up people. You want to pick up anyone you suspect of being dangerous. What's different here is the government, for the first time in our history, didn't follow its own regulations, which require that a hearing be held promptly after capture if there's any doubt.
In the war in Afghanistan back in 2001, the U.S. military was prepared to follow the Geneva Conventions and conduct those tribunals. Unfortunately, the civilian leadership within the Department of Defense told them to stop. Once somebody in Afghanistan might have said, okay, this person's a high-value target, for whatever reason, whether it was based on some other Afghani who hated that person and wanted him out so he could take over his opium crop, then that began the road to Gitmo, and there was no way for that person to challenge it. And there still hasn't been.
Mozam Beg, a British subject suspected of ties to Al-Qaeda operatives, was picked up by local intelligence agents in Pakistan.
I was in my house in Islamabad at the time when I was abducted. A hood was placed over my head. My hands and legs were shackled, and I was physically carried into the back of the vehicle. I didn't see my family again after that point. I was sent to Kandahar and then to Bagram. And when I was put onto the transport plane to Guantanamo, I had already been covered almost from head to toe in some sort of a covering. Face mask, earmuffs, blackened goggles, and then, just in case I could see anything, a hood to cover it with. Being seated on the aircraft was excruciatingly painful. They'd already used now the three-piece suit, and that is the shackle that goes around the waist and is padlocked to the back. It was impossible to move, impossible to breathe properly, impossible to hear anything. And so I managed to scream and pleaded with one of the guards to give me a needle to put me to sleep.
We fought for 2.5 years for just the right to go see the prisoners, and then fought for months more to get security clearance so the military would let you in there. I mean, this is bizarre. It never occurred to me that when I went to law school in America that we'd be sitting around talking about whether we could have access to our clients and whether our clients had been tortured.
Habeas corpus is really the essence of the rule of law. Not giving people a basic hearing when you take away their liberty is one of the reasons we fought the revolution, that the king can't deprive somebody of liberty without a hearing.
In 2004, 2.5 years after the first detainees had arrived in Guantanamo, the Supreme Court rejected the Bush administration's claims that it could hold detainees indefinitely without allowing them to challenge their detention in the courts. After the decision, the military installed special new tribunals to judge whether detainees should remain in Guantanamo.
The combatant status review tribunals, which the government hurriedly put in place 9 days after we won before the Supreme Court, are a joke.
You have no right